Welcome to this presentation on the incarnational epistemology of Joseph Ratzinger in a Thomistic framework. My name is Shane Van Diest. This presentation is to meet the qualifications for Philosophy 611, Logic and Epistemology at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. First, we want to look at the epistemological framework of Thomas Aquinas. And for Aquinas, we know that it's impossible to speak of human knowledge as being divorced from divine knowledge. We also, when using Aquinas as a framework, have this necessary reliance on what he calls, or what Thomas will call, the theory of analogy. And these are assumptions that we have to start with unless we want to dive deep into Thomas's foundations about the existence of God and other aspects of his teaching that for this presentation are outside of our scope. So when Thomas looks at epistemology in a broad sense, one of the first things he does is look at the three different schools of epistemology, if you will. This is in the first part of the Summa, question 84, where he defines materialism as the discharge of images. So in this school of thought, there is not any distinction between the intellect and the senses. In a very real way, the object perceived enters into the object that is perceiving it. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have what he calls Platonism, this idea of epistemology that we can trace back to Plato, where he says that essentially all concepts are universal. So in this school of thought, knowledge has no relation to the senses. And in the third school of thought, we have what we might call Aristotelian realism. It's the via media, it's the middle way between these two extremes of materialism and Platonism. In Aristotelian realism, we see that things actually impress themselves upon the senses, and then an intellect is able to abstract real essences from these sense experiences. So one helpful quote from the first part of the Summa, question 79, article 4, we see that Aquinas says, "Above the intellectual soul of man, we must needs suppose a superior intellect, from which the soul acquires the power of understanding. For what is such by participation, and what is mobile, and what is imperfect, always requires the pre-existence of something essentially such, immovable and perfect." And so again, without going into Thomas's proofs for God, we can see that he logically is showing the existence of an intellectual capacity that is not perfect, presumes the existence of an intellectual capacity that is perfect. And this is why those ideas of analogy and participation are so important to Thomas, to natural law, to the church, and certainly to Ratzinger, as we'll see shortly. In the first part of the second part of the Summa, we see Thomas speak about intellectual virtue. He says that what is known in itself is as a principle, and is at once understood by the intellect. Wherefore the habit that perfects the intellect for the consideration of such truth is called understanding, which is the habit of principles. So habit, of course, implies a temporal and a material element to this process, an incarnational element, if you will. We also we know that moral virtue requires intellectual virtue because of the ordering of the human powers. But the question we ask ourselves is the opposite also true? In short, yes, the opposite is also true. Intellectual virtue is necessarily manifested in moral virtue, which is an act of the will. And this is found throughout Thomas's epistemology, that what is in the intellect must first be in the senses. Final thing we'll look at specifically from St. Thomas Aquinas, is the necessity of the body and of the passions. And here, again, in the first part of the second part, question 59, he states that the good of anything depends on the condition of its nature. Now there is no sensitive appetite in God and the angels, as there is in man. Consequently, good operation in God and the angels is altogether without passion, as it is without a body, whereas the good operation of man is with passion, even as it is produced with the body's help. So let's unpack this briefly. This is perhaps the clearest articulation of the thesis that will be supported when we look at Ratzinger. For God and the angels, who are without bodies and thus without passions, there is no incarnational imperative to their acquisition of knowledge. But for humans, who are necessarily bodily and thus with passions, the acquisition of knowledge is necessarily incarnational. It's intimately tied up with the flesh, we might say. Now we'll take a brief look at Ratzinger's epistemology. One helpful teaching in this area is his critique of relativism. For our purposes, we'll be looking at this paper, Relativism, the Central Problem for Faith Today, published in 1996. And in dealing with relativism, he says that relativism is presented as apparent freedom, concepts which would be limited if the existence of one valid truth for all were affirmed. And he makes a really important distinction here between political relativism, in which he says, in the area of politics, relativism is considerably right, because there is no one correct political opinion. On the other hand, when dealing with what we might call total relativism, he notes that not only is this concept contradictory, but it prevents us from being able to speak about a true epistemology. And so while relativism is good in the political realm, we see that it's destructive and irrational when it's applied in a totalitarian sense. He also points out a couple specific problems, three that we'll look at here. His problem with Kant, his problem with what we might call dialogue, and his problem with Marx. For Kant, he says that Kantian distinction between phenomenon and noumenon, in this we can never grasp ultimate truth in itself, but only its appearance in our way of perceiving through different lenses. What we grasp, then, is not really and properly reality in itself, but a reflection on our scale. So for Kant, all we can know is our experience, but this experience is not participating in anything objectively true or eternal, and we certainly can't speak of something like natures or essences. In his problem with dialogue, he says that only if I suppose in principle that the other can be as right or more right than I, can an authentic dialogue take place. So what we see here is that for the Christian, this is actually impossible, at least in the way this term is used by Ratzinger, and I think many of us in our world today, that say that we have to necessarily start dialogue from a place where we assume all theories are equally probable of being correct. And this is, of course, problematic for the honest philosopher and impossible for the theologian. With respect to Marx, we see that for Marx, he puts praxis above knowledge, and by extension puts orthopraxis above orthodoxy. And of course, by praxis, we just here mean what is practiced, processed, realized. It's important to note that orthodoxy, the way that it's traditionally understood, and the way that Ratzinger is using the term, actually implies both belief, or knowledge, and practice. So both of those things are swallowed up in this term. And we see this throughout the understanding of the Catholic faith, that it's a faith of both words and deeds, a faith of both creed and sacrifice, etc. As we continue on in this same work on relativism, he notes that the faith, together with its praxis, either comes to us from the Lord through his church and the sacramental ministry, or it does not exist in absolute. He also poses this rhetorical question of why does the faith still have a chance? His response is that because it is in harmony with what man is. And then we'll pull one quote here from this work, Behold the Pierced One, from Ignatius Press, published in 1986, where he notes that there is an indivisible inner unity of Jesus and Christ, and of the Church, and of history. And so just to point out briefly, Ratzinger is here noting the vehicle through which our participation in God is mediated. Namely, this is through the Church. He gives us this nod toward the alignment of the intellect and the will, right, by the recognition that our truth and our practice of that truth is necessarily implied. And so he's not only hinting at the necessary compatibility of faith and reason, but that there are real essences and natures that can be known through the intellect and practiced through the will. So here we see the key to Ratzinger's epistemology is the person of Jesus Christ. He notes in this same work, Behold the Pierced One, that the term Son is a basic confession in the sense that it provides the key to interpretation, making everything else accessible and intelligible. And so for Ratzinger, Jesus' sonship, precisely his relationality with the Father and his kenosis, or becoming human, is what allows us to understand the intelligibility of ourselves, of God, of the universe, essentially anything that we can classify as real knowledge. And this is a bold claim, that Jesus is not an addendum on the human condition, but that he is its focal point and the lens through which it comes into focus. We also see Ratzinger state that by nature, knowledge depends on a certain similarity between the knower and the known. And this is a nod to that old axiom, that old well-known axiom, that like is known by like. And so he even gives us some examples that we see in Thomas as well. That to know mathematics, we have to engage in mathematics. To know philosophy, we have to do philosophy, which for the Thomist means that we inquire about sense wonder. To know people, we have to, in a sense, become one with that person. And to know God, we enter into, in whatever way we're able, into the life of God. And so the incarnational aspects here are very clear. And finally, we want to look at what we might call epistemological realism. Ratzinger says that the question of truth and the question of freedom are involved in the question of being, and therefore also in the question of God. So let's follow his logic chain here. Truth, which is the content of our knowledge, and freedom, the expression of this truth in action, are not able to be divorced from ontology, or nature of being, which, as we have established, is necessarily dependent on God, since our imperfect being, and everything that goes along with that, is a participation in him who is being itself. And as Aquinas would say, ipsum esse subsistens. He also noted there in the same work that God does not remain hidden for all eternity beneath the clouds of imagery. He actually touches man and allows himself to be touched by man in the person of him who is the Son. So we can see that real communication via the incarnation is the point of mediation in our coming to know of God, and thus we can say our coming to know anything. So in summary here, we can see first of all that Ratzinger is clearly in line with Thomas on this subject of epistemology. Now, he's clearly approaching it from an unabashedly theological view. He's a theologian by trade. Whereas Thomas, at least in the Summa, is doing so primarily from a philosophical framework. And so let's just review very briefly our line of thought here. First, we can say that the Son, the person of Jesus Christ, through his incarnation, is the key to understanding God. Secondly, we can say that all knowledge is really a participation in God's own knowledge. Third, we can say that we know the Son through his likeness to us, right? Because like knows like. And then finally, we can say that epistemology is necessarily and by definition an incarnational epistemology.